I have to apologize, class. For the past week, I've been slowly getting under each of your skin. And today's going to be exactly the same because we are going to talk about the layers of skin going superficial to deep. This is week 6, ANP1 review, and we're going to be going over two different sort of sections. The first one is going to be all about the skin, and then in the next video, I'm going to be going over the skeletal system, the components, functions, and all that. But with the skin, what we're going to talk about is the layers, the structures within the layers, and also what the cells are doing as they're moving up and well, specifically up through the epidermal layer. And we'll talk about the functions of those things, as well as discuss skin color. There's probably more, but the three main factors we've talked about with skin color, and then also cancer risk and cancer types within the skin. So let's get rolling. So first off, I've got a great diagram of the skin here. I drew it myself. The three layers of the skin are as follows. We have our epidermis, which is the most superficial, which means the most exterior part of the skin. That's going to be consistent of 5 different layers, which we'll talk about in a second. The main portion of your skin is called the dermis. This is the dermal layer. And this is where all the fun happens because we've got blood vessels, we've got nerves, small smooth muscles, sweat glands, all these things are in the dermal layer. Then the last layer isn't technically a part of the integument, which is the skin, so the epidermis and the dermis. This is called the subcutaneous layer, which primarily is made of adipose tissue, so fat for insulation, and also for connection between subcutaneous tissue and all of the underlying structures, which would be like muscles or organs, perhaps. So yeah, a couple things about the tissue types. The epidermis will be stratified squamous epithelial tissue, as well as keratinized versus non-keratinized. We'll talk about that in here in a bit. The dermal layer is going to be primarily dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, so we got some collagen fibers all oriented in different ways. And then in the basement membrane of the epidermis, so the connection between the two will be more areolar connective tissue, a little looser to provide for a little bit of stretching, but not too much. Great, let's talk about the epidermis. Epi means on top of the dermis, and there's 5 layers of the epidermis, all of which will be preceded by the word stratum, because there are 5 layers. Strata refers to layer, so there's 5 layers of the epidermis. The most superficial is called the stratum corneum. The second is lucidum. The third is granulosum. Second to last is spinosum. And then lastly, we've got our basal layer, or basale layer. I'm primarily going to talk about the corneum and the basal layer, okay? So, as your epidermis divides and sheds, there's a very specific process happening. What's happening is these basal cells are dividing. So we call these mitotically active cells. Mitotically active means they are undergoing mitosis, which is cell division. So as they are dividing, they are going to slowly push upwards until they get to the most superficial layer. They'll die and they will get sloughed off, okay? In the basal layer, there's 2 cell types. There's the basal cells, which are the normal ones that we see right here. But then there are these weird branch-like cells that look like this, and these are your melanocytes. So these melanocytes, as you can probably guess, produce melanin. Melano stands for melanin, cyte is cell, so melanin-producing cell. So you've got basal cells and melanocytes. Quick digression. Since they are mitotically active, they are very susceptible to developing cancer. Why? Because cancer is unregulated cell division. So if these 2 cell types get damaged, it's higher chance that the genes dealing with cell division would get mutated, which would eventually cause cancer. The 2 cancers that we talked about in class are basal cell carcinoma, carcin referring to cancer, like carcinogen, as well as melanoma. You've probably heard of that one before. So melanoma is the cancer of the melanocytes. Basal cell carcinoma is the cancer of the basal cells. And then there's also a different one called a squamous cell carcinoma, which will be primarily the upper levels of the epidermis. So as a quick digression, so let's talk about as they move up, what will happen is the cells will gain keratin. So cells will gain keratin, and keratin is this protein pigment that protects against abrasion, so friction. So it provides the toughness to the epidermis. So as they gain keratin, you can see these little keratohyalin precursor pigments in these primarily granulosum and spinosum layer. And as they move upwards, what happens is the cells actually die, and eventually they will get sloughed off. Okay, why do they die? Well, they die because they lose their blood supply. If you look at the dermal layer here, the dermal layer has the blood supply. So the basal cells and the cells close to the blood supply, so like the basal cell, the spinosum, they're close to the blood supply, so they're going to be just fine. They'll get nutrients by diffusion, but then as they get pushed further and further away, they lose the blood supply, they lose their nutrients, therefore the cells will die. Okay? So eventually these cells will die as they get to the outer layer, the stratum corneum. I believe once they get to the stratum lucidum layer, they are already dead. And eventually they get sloughed off. That whole process from the division of the basal cells all the way up to get sloughed off is about 1 month to 1.5 months. So 30 days is probably a good guess. Great, so we just went through the skin layer of epidermis, the 5 different parts. We talked about the melanocytes, we talked about basal cells, cancers, great. I'm going to digress a little bit as well. We talked about keratin and melanin. These are 2 of the factors in skin color. If you have more melanin, which is a protein, you will appear darker. And the reverse is true. If you have less melanin, your skin will be lighter. Okay? So a cool thing about melanin, though, is it's not just a pigment that gives the dark and light. It's actually a protein that protects you from UVA and UVB rays. And we know about those rays that they can break down our DNA. So it's incredibly important to have melanin primarily in those basal cells and the melanocytes and these lower levels of the epidermis because they're going to be susceptible to that cancer. So the melanin is almost like a protective agent against the damage that UVA and B rays can do. So we see a trend, if we look geographically, the people who live near the equator who are getting the most UVA and B sunlight are usually darker skinned people. Whereas if you live near the poles where there's less UVA and B light, the skin is lighter. So they don't need as much protection, they don't have as much radiation hitting them, so they simply didn't need the pigment. So over time, the people in the poles of the earth would get lighter skinned, and the people near the equator would have darker skin, purely based on how much melanin they are producing. And that's also linked to genetics, because melanin's a protein. We make proteins from our DNA, from those instructions. So if you have darker skin, your genes that make melanin, your melanocytes, are going to be pumping out a bunch of melanin constantly. And it's also produced in response to a lot of sun exposure, so that's why you also get a little darker when you tan. And that's also due to inflammation, but I'm not going to talk about that. So that's one thing with melanin. The other protein is keratin. Keratin, like I said earlier, is protection against abrasion. Okay, so the most abrasive parts, the areas of your body that get a lot of pressure and friction, are primarily in your palms with your calluses. So you see how they kind of appear this orange color. And if you were to look at the bottom of your feet, your soles of your feet, and the heel, you'd also see this kind of like yellowish, whitish, orangish color, because that's the color of keratin. So the more keratin you have, the more yellowish and thick that area of epidermis will be. Which makes sense because it's a protective agent against abrasion and friction. So that's melanin and keratin, and the last thing that can affect your skin color will be your blood. Okay, 2 parts of that, your blood. First, your flow of blood to the area, and what is actually in the blood, so the composition. For example, if you are warm, if you are very warm, you usually appear a certain color, and that color is red. That is because when you are warm, your blood vessels are trying to increase in surface area to release more heat from the bloodstream. So that is called vasodilation. So when you are warm, your blood vessels will vasodilate. So instead of looking like that small, they'll go like this. They'll vasodilate, and that releases heat, more heat. So you cool off, and you appear red. Because there's more blood flow coming to the surface, and so that's why you appear red. However, if you are cold, you want to conserve the heat. So instead, your blood vessels will go from vasodilated to vasoconstricted. This will conserve heat, and you will appear, when you are cold, pale. You will appear pale. Great. So that's one way that we both regulate temperature through our skin is through the vasodilation or vasoconstriction of our blood vessels. And it's also how we determine kind of redness and whiteness in our color. These can also be stimulated by different things. So when you're blushing, okay, you get embarrassed, it'll vasodilate, especially all the vessels around your face. It's just an emotional reaction to something. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, too. Okay, so I said the flow is important, but also the composition. We talked about 3 different things that can be in your blood that will cause different coloration of your skin. These are the 3 that we talked about. We talked about a condition called jaundice. We talked about a condition called cyanosis. And we also talked about having high levels of beta-carotene in your blood. Okay, so jaundice is when bile leaks into your bloodstream. This is especially common in babies. For some reason, there will be a little bit of bile that's usually released into your intestines that seeps into your bloodstream. Okay, and if it seeps into your bloodstream, it appears kind of this yellow color, this yellow tint. So if you have bile in your blood, you are yellow. You also see this with people who have liver failure because the gallbladder is releasing the bile within the liver. If the liver is failing, bile leaks in your bloodstream, your eyes will appear yellow, and that's when you know you need to go to the hospital. So if you see somebody with jaundice and they are an adult, tell them to go to the emergency room, please. All right, next one, cyanosis. Cyan is a shade of blue. So this will turn you blue because you have low oxygen in your blood. This is also common when you are first born. You don't have a lot of oxygen in your blood because you're having to breathe for the first time. So sometimes babies can just have underactive lungs, and that means they have low blood oxygen, so they can appear kind of blue. And so good thing to do for them is give them a little bit of oxygen, maybe in a hyperbaric chamber. Make sure they get pumped full of oxygen so that their blood saturation of oxygen can increase, and they won't be blue anymore. Last one, for those of you who want to be a pumpkin for Halloween, eat a bunch of beta-carotene, which is in primarily sweet potatoes and carrots, because beta-carotene gives an orange hint. So if you eat a lot of that type of pigment, it's vitamin A actually, you will appear slightly orange. Now you would have to eat a ton of carrots and sweet potatoes, so if you want to go as a pumpkin for Halloween, I would start preparing now and chock your blood full of beta-carotene. Awesome. That is skin color, okay? So we're done with skin color. We talked about cancer. We talked about some proteins. We talked about skin layers. Let's talk about the structure and function of these structures in the dermis. So this picture that I drew is incredibly simplified, but I do think it shows a few good structures that I want to talk about briefly. So first off, you've got your hair follicle attached to this little red muscle, which also has a gland coming off of it, some nerves. This is a sweat gland, and then here's all of your bloodstream. Now, there's going to be other structures, accessory structures that I'm not going to talk about that are in here, but these are the ones that we mentioned in class. So let's start with the sweat gland. It's easy. Sweat gland produces, obviously, sweat. There's eccrine versus apocrine. I'm not going to test you over the differences. One is, so the eccrine one is found in the dermal layer, and it's going to do that evaporative cooling. So it's going to secrete fluid, it's going to evaporate off your skin, cooling you off. There's also going to be apocrine sweat glands that are going to be embedded more in your subcutaneous layer. they secrete more fluid that deals with antimicrobial properties and keeping your skin clean and protected from viral agents, bacteria, those types of things. So, sweat glands. I'm going to combine all of these guys together. So first off, the sebaceous gland is attached to your hair follicle. The sebaceous gland secretes oils. So sebaceous gland secretes oils. And this is mostly for, nourishing the hair, lubricating it, so just protecting it from damage. Then the hair follicle, since we don't necessarily use our hair to trap heat like primates do, this is almost what's called a vestigial structure in humans, where it's a structure left over from evolutionary history that doesn't really serve a purpose. However, we can experience things attributed to our hair follicles. So let's talk about that. You see this smooth muscle, and this is called the erector pili muscle. I'll write it down here. This is the erector pili muscle. And it is attached to our hair follicles, which is this whole thing. This is your hair follicle, or just your hair. And then you also see these little sensory nerves surrounding your hair. This is where things can get applicable. So first off, the erector pili muscle is a smooth muscle. You cannot voluntarily control it. It will act whether you like it or not. This is stimulated by cold, because when you're cold, you get goosebumps, and the smooth muscle will basically, this is the erector pili muscle and this is the hair, it will pull the hair straight up, and you'll get goosebumps. That can also happen in response to some sort of emotional experience, whether you listen to music that's beautiful and you get the goosebumps, you kind of get the chills. It's the same sort of nervous input into your muscle to tell it to contract, but it's a different stimulus, which is kind of fascinating. We'll talk about that in the nervous system in a later chapter. So your erector pili muscle is stimulated when it's cold. Again, it's a vestigial structure because that doesn't really keep you warm. It did for primates earlier in evolutionary history, but not as much for us. So it's more of just an involuntary response now. But what I did focus a lot on in class are these sensory nerves. So first off, with sensory nerves in your skin, you can experience 5 different sensations. You can feel hot, cold, you can feel pain, you can feel pressure, and you can feel touch. Just general touch. Now, with your hair, since it is attached to sensory nerves, this gives us a very good benefit, especially if you live in the jungle. Because there's a lot of creepy crawly things that are super lightweight that can kill you, but you couldn't feel it if it just stood on your skin and you didn't have hair. So whenever your hair is slightly brushed, you feel that sensory input very, very clearly. Because if you pull this hair back, those nerves are going to get stimulated. So it's incredibly important to feel those light sensations of a bug crawling up your arm that you need to swat off. So those sensory neurons are incredibly important. It also explains why it hurts so much when you pull your hair out, right? When you pluck your eyelash or your eyebrows, it hurts because you're basically sending a bunch of pain signals back because you're pulling your hair out of its follicle. Okay? So that's a little bit on the sensory nerves. Fun fact, whenever you hit your funny bone, all 5 of these senses are triggered back to your brain. So you're experiencing hot, cold, pain, pressure, and touch all at once when you hit your funny bone. It's a weird little nerve. It annoys us a lot. I believe those are all the structures of the dermis that I went through in class. The last thing I will say is that the subcutaneous layer is made primarily of adipose tissue, so fat tissue for insulation, for some energy stores. So whenever somebody starves or is starving to death, a lot of the times their skin kind of gets tight and their eyes fall back into their head because all this adipose tissue is being used up for energy so that they can survive. And it'll also attach basically the dermal layer to underlying structures. Okay? I remember the last thing I didn't teach on right now. These little ridges on the top, the most superficial part of the dermis, are called the dermal papillae. So these are the dermal papillae. Papillae just means kind of like a ridge or papilla. So these are ridges that give you your fingerprint. So everybody has different dermal papillae. Extra credit question, here it is. When you stick your hand in water and it prunes up, it is not the water that is seeping into your skin nor the water leaving your skin, because your skin is an impenetrable barrier, right? It is your nervous system basically triggering the shriveling up of your skin, which allows you to grip things underwater a little better. So that is a crazy fun fact that'll likely be an extra credit question. Hope this was helpful, guys. I'll step to the side if you need to write anything in. In the next video, we'll go over the skeletal system. So thank you for watching. I hope this is helpful, and comment with any questions you may have.